have a quick question.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not really a chapter, right? It's part one. So it has a lot of sections in it, which would explain why it's so long. So if you didn't want to read the entire part of part one, we could like split it up, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
but just
a couple of sections from each part at a time, or I mean, I don't know what the content are, but
chapter one within part one looks like it's about 40 pages. So from like 13 to 52. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how we feel after we start. But let's look. Actually, I kind of assumed you guys weren't gonna have read anything, but I think everyone's already read this. So
little faith.
Oh, yeah. So let's see. How do we want to do this? Yeah, let me just read here or maybe someone can read the first paragraph for me. Who's going to read that for me? The first paragraph in the preface.
I don't even have it.
I'll read.
Okay. Thanks.
Should I wait for Jackie to get back?
Nah.
I can hear you.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Asked to picture the earliest churches, the congregations founded and ministered to by the apostles, many today imagine a meager gathering in a small home, likely a bare room. The people would sit on the floor facing a visiting apostle or teacher who would lead them in worship, perhaps by singing a hymn or psalm and praying. Then he would teach the group. His message, so it is assumed, would have been simple. Jesus is the Messiah. He had died for their sins. They should put their faith and trust in him, and they would go to heaven when they died. In the meantime, they ought to set aside their sinful ways and love one another. Simple, unadorned, plain. That is how many people imagine the religion of the apostles to have been.
All right, so I think that's actually probably a pretty fair description of if we were to oh, I see. We do also have someone else joining us, but they're not visible. So I don't know how much they've read. So I think it's a pretty fair assumption of, especially here in America. I think if you would, pry and dig a little deeper and get people to try to really verbalize what it is they are assuming about the early church, the quote unquote New Testament church, the Church of the Apostles, I think probably this is what most people have in mind. Like, do you think that's fair? Is that something that you held in your mind at some point, or even now, or maybe if you're a convert before you became Orthodox?
I think very definitely from a growing up as a Protestant, that's exactly how I would view the church, just a simple, unadorned, dirt floor.
I think that's what
I'm sorry. But that's how I would have viewed it. Yes, very much so, with a simple, unadorned dirt floor, visiting apostle. Or
well, I think from the New Testament, from the book of Acts, I think.
I think, Nezra, I think your connection is probably not good. That's what it seems like to me. Just keep coming in and out.
Frozen.
I think it looks like you're
Okay.
It looks like Nezra's on her phone, and sometimes the phone is a bit slower than the processing is a bit slower.
Now you're back.
All right, so let's go on here for a second. All right, so all right, then let's see. And then he kind of contrasts this with someone's first impression of the Orthodox Church when they come in today in our times, a very kind of ornate, elaborate, ritualized, with ornate robes, incense, etc. And especially so for someone, let's say someone like Roger or myself, growing up Protestant, first exposure to Orthodoxy here in America, comes as a real shock. And so it's a little bit of, for us as Orthodox to then claim that we're the New Testament church, it's there's a real paradigm shift that has to take place in the way people are thinking, because they are thinking the simple, unadorned, and so this is it's important to realize this. I think he's right that this is this is the typical reaction of people. And so it's hard to connect those two. All right, so if we turn a page, I just wanted to look at, you see the footnote, and the footnote there, I think is important. So I'll just read it. A note on terminology. Throughout this book, I refer to religion of the Second Temple period, or even religion of the apostles, rather than the Judaism or Jewish religion. As will become clear in this book, the religion of Judeans scattered throughout the Roman world in the Second Temple period was varied and diverse, to the point that some scholars have argued that the term Judaism is misleading when used in reference to this time period. Second Temple Judaism is not the name of a single religion, but a catch-all term for the religious belief and practice of Jewish people. So I would say, from what I've read so far, in this preface and the first bit about St. Paul as a convert, I think Father Stephen, I don't know Father Stephen, but I actually did get his email, and I wrote him the other day to ask him if he would be willing to join us on one of our Zooms this summer.
Oh, wow.
We'll see if he responds. He's a priest in the Antiochian Archdiocese. He's located in Louisiana. And he has a couple podcasts that he does for Ancient Faith Radio. One is called The Whole Counsel of God, where it's a Bible study, a chapter at a time. And then he has a new one called Lord of the Spirits, which I've heard a lot about, but I haven't actually listened to myself, but it sounds very interesting. But I think what he's done here is he's taken a lot of academic research into the Old Testament, into the religious practices of this time period, and he's kind of synthesized it for us and made it more accessible for non-academics, non-experts. And so, I remember when I was studying for my master's degree, it was in New Testament and early Christianity, which is the same period. We discussed a big part of what we did was understanding Second Temple Judaism. And so I can say that what he's telling us here about kind of the current state of academia is very correct, that it's not even very controversial what he's saying. If you were to ask rabbis, everything that I've read that he's said so far about Rabbinic Judaism and the state of Judaism at this time is not controversial. So, when he's talking here about Judaism being varied and diverse, that is one of the real keys we have to keep in mind. So if we talk about, just to give you kind of an overview, a timeline. So let's say that, Moses leads the people of Israel out of Egypt somewhere around, let's say 1400 BC. So around 1000 BC, you have David and his son Solomon. So there's about a 400-year period where the people of Israel are worshiping God in this mobile tabernacle, this tent structure that God reveals how it's to be set up in a very precise way. And God is worshipped in this mobile structure as he travels with his people Israel from Egypt through the 40 years in the wilderness. During their campaigns, once they reach the promised land, there's the campaigns to conquer the land. And so it's really, by the time you get to David is kind of consolidating the people of God, the people of Israel. He's consolidating their kind of grasp on the land there. He conquers Jerusalem and takes it over. And then it's his desire, David's desire, to give God a proper permanent place of worship to dwell. And it was really considered that God dwelt with his people. And it's really interesting here about the whole idea of the temple. In the first place, God never asks for a temple, and God doesn't really usually ask for things in the Old Testament. He says how it's going to be. And then he never asks for a temple. He never says, give me a temple. This is David's heart's desire. And I think there's a way you can read it that, that God doesn't necessarily even want or desire this permanent temple, because in the religion of the Near East at the time, the religions of all the peoples around there, the basic idea of religion was that you were capturing God by creating a space for him. So like the ziggurat, was the basics, was often the structure. It was basically like a pyramid-like structure in ancient religion. And the idea was that you're actually kind of sucking, if you're going to put it very crudely, kind of sucking God down and capturing him in this pyramid structure, right? And then within that, there would be an idol. There would be a statue or representation, some kind of that God, which showed him kind of like a genie in the bottle, kind of captured within this temple structure, right? And so then you would go in and you would offer, you would offer your sacrifices, and there would be a bit of exchange happening. I'm going to offer this. I'm requesting this in return. And because he was kind of captured in this place, that's where the human and the divine met, and that's where they negotiated with each other, right? So, but for Yahweh, the God of Israel, he's always above this, right? He can't be captured. He refuses to be captured, and made this kind of genie that you rub the lamp and he comes out and grants your wishes. He can't be captured like that. But somehow, because of the purity of David's desire to honor God, God allows for this temple to come to fruition, not by David, but by his son Solomon. And so the first temple was built, and I think it's somewhere around 957 BC or something like that is when they date it to. So approximately 1000 BC, 1000 years before Christ. So, long story short, that first temple survives until the 500s. In the 500s, the Neo-Babylonian Empire comes and exiles a portion of the people of Israel, and they destroy that first temple. This is about 587 BC. When the people of Israel return from exile in Babylon, maybe in the 530s, there's a desire to rebuild the temple. And it's usually said that it's estimated that the second temple was completed approximately 515 BC, something like that. Everyone following me so far?
Mm-hmm.
All right, and so this is important because it's this place where God dwells. They literally believed that God's presence was there. But for the Israelites, they never created an image or an idol like the other religions around them did to place inside the temple. Instead, all they had was at least in the first temple, they had the Ark of the Covenant. So they had, which had been carried with them even in the mobile worship of the tabernacle. So you have the second temple built around 515 BC. Now, this is what he is talking about when he's talking about Second Temple Judaism. Usually, they refer to, you might hear the term, if someone talks about ancient Judaism, they're referring really to 1400 through, it could be through 500, something like that. This is the ancient Judaism. That if they talk about first temple, they're talking about 1000 to 500, something like that. But this is kind of the ancient Israel. And really, it's not clear what state the scriptures were in. So when they returned from the exile in the 500s, 500 BC, it says there that the law had kind of been forgotten, and the King Josiah discovers the scrolls of the Torah, of the first five books of the Old Testament. And so scholars here, he's going to kind of allude to this. Scholars, aren't sure what state actually those books were in. So at this point, there's an idea that they may have only existed really in oral tradition, which wouldn't have been surprising. And that it's at this point, whatever they find them in, there's an oral tradition of them. There's maybe some scrolls that survived the destruction of the first temple. Now is when they start recording and putting down on paper the first five books and a few other books of the scriptures. So, but the Second Temple Judaism, what he's talking about is now during this period, because of the exile of the Jews to Babylon, now you have a Jewish community that continues in Babylon, and you have the scattering of the Jews throughout the whole Mediterranean. So that, and then with Alexander the Great, 300 BC, you have this scattering of the Jews throughout the Mediterranean, and they're connecting. The language becomes Greek, etc. So you get this diversity of practices, which we saw even in Acts when remember in Acts when Paul's going around the Mediterranean basin there in Greece, he's finding all these synagogues located throughout modern day Turkey and Greece. When he goes to Philippi in northern Greece, he can't find a synagogue. But what does anyone remember what he finds in Philippi? He's looking for the Jews there.
He finds them down on the near the water.
Near the water.
Just a small community.
Yeah, and so there's some women who are gathering for prayer, some kind of Jewish prayer at the river, which seems to be a thing during Second Temple Judaism in the diaspora. There's nothing about that, of course, in the scriptures, right? That's not. But you see this kind of diversity of practice. You see people, because of the distance, there's not a communication. There's going to be a diversity of practice of Judaism. All right, move along, tangent. All right, yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I got into the second chapter a little bit. He was talking about the presence of God among his people and the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
And he talks about how, he was experienced. It's not like when I hear believed, I think about, it's just we just think something in our head, but they experienced God, and they talk about like the cloud of glory and the fire and how it dwelt in the temple. I mean, in the tent. And then when the Solomon built the temple, it said it came and appeared again, but in the second temple it didn't appear.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That was interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think we got to get out of this way of thinking we tend to project back our own way of viewing things. So which is more of a kind of a Protestant based sola scriptura, everything based on the written word. And we have to there is some truth to that. I mean, the Jews were known as a people of the book. There was this importance of the written word, but it's not exactly the same as what we think about, like a Protestant group that's only about the scriptures, right? And you're kind of trying to reconstruct everything out of the scriptures. It's not the same thing. There were the scriptures, which were inspired by God, which were a recording of God's dealing with his people. But there was also, first and foremost, this lived experience of God, God traveling with his people, literally, before there were even scriptures. All right, so now if we go to the next page, if we were at Roman numeral 13, the very bottom, I think this is an interesting part where it says, before that, scholarship had long taken for granted that the religion practiced by Judeans in the first century AD was identical to religion as practiced by later Rabbinic Judaism. This is simply not the case. So when I say Rabbinic Judaism, this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because when people talk about Judaism or ancient Judaism, like I said, we're talking about maybe 1400, maybe to 500 BC. When we're talking about Rabbinic Judaism or modern Judaism, and again, this is not a controversial thing. Most rabbis today would not disagree with this. Modern Judaism is Rabbinic Judaism. We can just kind of interchange those terms here. So in Rabbinic Judaism, the point that he wants to make here is that Rabbinic Judaism really only takes shape around the 5th or 6th century AD. 5th or 6th. So modern Judaism as we know it really only traces back to the 5th or 6th century AD, where it becomes kind of solidified. Now you can find its roots, of course, tracing back to ancient Judaism, but as it comes to its current kind of form, really 5th or 6th century AD, which is after the formation of the core of Christianity. Now, this is something that's really, it's a paradigm shift for us to think about it in this way, but this is not even a controversial thing to say. Rabbis will agree with this. All right, so it was taken for granted that the religion that we're imagining that the Jews, Judeans, so meaning the people of Judea, this kind of southern portion of Israel, the religion that they practiced in the 1st century AD, Jesus' time, the apostles' time, was identical to religion as practiced by later Rabbinic Judaism. So in other words, we're reading these documents from the 5th, 6th century AD, and even today's practice of Judaism as we see it from Jews that we live with, and we're projecting it back into Jesus' time. And he's saying, no, that's wrong. This is we're not. It's a anachronism. So he says, Rabbinic Judaism came to flower only in the 5th century AD with the codification of the Talmud. So the Talmud is this kind of, you might hear the term Mishnah also. Mishnah and Talmud are a kind of set of definitive commentaries on the Old Testament, on the Pentateuch, the Torah in particular. So from the major rabbis of the tradition, a lot of whom are around Jesus's time. So Hillel, Shammai, Gamaliel, who was referenced as Paul's teacher. Gamaliel is one of these definitive commentators to understand the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so these figures who are over several centuries commentating, interpreting the Old Testament, finally in the 5th century AD, all these are kind of codified, put together, and like this becomes the definitive way of understanding, interpreting the first 5 books. This is the basis of Rabbinic Judaism. So, all right, Christianity, he says here in the last line on Roman numeral 13, Christianity had already emerged several centuries before Rabbinic Judaism, which was itself a reaction against Christian faith and practice. That is absolutely true. So we tend to get this kind of we think of it the other way around, but that is not the case. And this again is from academics. All right, so we turn the page, and he's describing, he's saying with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. So now he's giving us this very helpful timeline there. Roman numeral 14. So we have the destruction of the Second Temple, which let's say it was finished 515 BC. It's finally destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, after 35, 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And since that time, as we know, has not been a new temple. But he notes here that with that, with the Second Temple, in the Second Temple, everything was revolving around the priesthood and the sacrifices and the prayers that took place in the temple. And the center of authority was the temple, and the authority figures were the priesthood. Now, with the destruction of the temple, there's a radical shift. Now the center of authority shifts to these synagogues, which were simply kind of almost cultural centers in a way, where they also, religion being an integral part of culture, the scriptures were studied, etc. Now the power shifts to the synagogue and the rabbis, the teachers. Everyone following me?
Mhm.
All right. Any questions? Comments? All right. So then on the next page, on 15, he mentions that the texts of the Old Testament come into their final form during the Second Temple period. So, meaning after 500. So, and this is not very controversial. So the form that we have the Old Testament texts in, really, doesn't reach that final form until after 500 BC. So, even the law that was written down and received by Moses in 1300 BC doesn't receive its final written form until 800 years later, maybe, right? Because it's being passed down by oral tradition, which was the norm in ancient cultures. Oral tradition was actually considered more reliable than written tradition. And then in 15, he starts to explain the project of his book. So he's going to lay out a couple points that he thinks what he's trying to accomplish with this book. So in the middle of Roman numeral 15, he says that he wants in particular, the book seeks to correct several such presuppositions, in particular, the claim that the church's history and theology can be explained by an evolutionary paradigm. So what's he mean about this? So this is, he lists this as the number one objective of his book. All right, so I actually, this I would maybe I don't disagree with him, but I would say I think he puts a little bit too fine a point on this because did you guys notice he talked several times about fighting back against this idea that the church's doctrine and teaching developed, right? He's fighting against that. I think, to me so far, obviously he's going to prove this point throughout the rest of the book, but I think he's making a little bit too strong an argument against this word developed. It depends on how we're going to define it. I think you could say the church has said that things develop, that there's a development of doctrine, and that's not a bad thing, meaning, as he says elsewhere, that not that the church created something new, but that it was forced because of controversies, because of heresies, it was forced to articulate what it had always held. It was forced to articulate it in a kind of a new way to respond to new challenges. So I'm comfortable calling that a development of doctrine, but he's pushing back against that because he wants to make sure we understand it's not developing something new. It's simply kind of fleshing out, explaining what's already existed. Yeah, Jason, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think he's saying that the idea of the Trinity wasn't something like there was this idea of this monotheism, like we think of one God, one person, and then all of a sudden Jesus shows up and they're trying to think, well, I guess there's two people, and then, okay, there's a third person too, I guess. He's saying like he wants to show how there's at least the binary God before Jesus appears in the flesh. And it didn't develop in that sense, I think.
Yeah. So yeah.
The evolution, he said, did not take place. This evolution, as today they claim that evolved, the church evolved, but he is saying it didn't evolve as people seem to think. It was the basic belief of the early church, which has never changed. Correct?
Yeah. Yep, correct. So and here's an interesting point. So it's obvious what he's pushing back against. He's pushing back against this kind of modern meaning, like, especially since the 1800s. There's this modern Protestant academic point of view about the development of the church as an evolution. And this actually goes hand in hand with Darwin's idea of evolution. So this idea that the church evolved didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was in this idea that the church evolved into its current form, goes hand in hand with Darwin's idea of evolution taking hold in our culture. So the whole world, this was such a revolutionary idea, evolution, that everyone started seeing evolution everywhere, right? So that you have, even especially among the Protestants in Germany and in England, studying the New Testament, the scriptures, as believing Christians in the 1800s, they start from an academic perspective to say, all right, look, the scriptures must have evolved into their current form, just as humans evolved into their current, more advanced form from rudimentary elements. The same thing must have happened with the scriptures. The current form that we've received it in, this advanced form, must have evolved from rudimentary elements. And so this is where they try to go back and find all these different sources in the Old Testament and the New Testament, try to break down even verse by verse, word for word. Okay, these verses must have come from a source that Mark had or that Luke had, and here's another source, and you can see where they've pieced them together here, et cetera, et cetera. This was this idea of that there was an evolution, right? And it was totally influenced by this biological evolutionary idea. So what he's saying is, so in that same way, just as they did with the scriptures, they also started to do with the church's dogma and doctrine and ritual. They started to say, okay, obviously we have an advanced form that we've received, but it must have come from these rudimentary parts and then built up and evolved. And so he's really trying to push back against this as a very modern way of understanding the development of religion. If we understand development meaning that it gets explained in different ways as a result of different confrontations it faces, I don't think we have a problem with that. If we're saying that it evolved in the same way that supposedly humans evolved, where we have a single cell organism and then it develops into, you know, a chimpanzee and it's et cetera. And then at some point in this kind of continuum of evolution, all of a sudden it becomes a man and it's infused with a soul. And in the same way, the same thing happened with the church, that, you know, it was evolved until it really reached this perfect form, which is usually considered to be like with Martin Luther. And there, you know, the Holy Spirit came back and it kind of animated this lifeless, dead pagan church that the Christians had made it. So it's all being influenced by this Darwin's evolution. So this is what he's pushing back against. All right, so now just to understand where he's coming from. So he's saying, so point one, he wants to show in this book that the claim that the church's history and theology can be explained by an evolutionary paradigm is false. This is what he wants to show. If we turn the page, Roman numeral 16, the first full paragraph there, he gives us point two that he wants to cover. The other major assumption this book seeks to rectify is the assumed discontinuity between Old and New Testaments, between biblical and extra-biblical literature, and between scripture and even the earliest apostolic fathers. So when he's saying biblical and extra-biblical literature, there's some literature, there's some writings that were written around the same time by the same kind of people in the same kind of places as the biblical writings, but that they were not included in the Bible. And so they're called extra biblical, outside of the Bible. And he's trying to challenge this idea that there's this major discontinuity between them. You know, that you know, the one, whatever the books are contained in the Bible contain the pure unvarnished truth. And if the book was not included in the Bible, then it contains nothing but garbage. And he's saying this is kind of a oversimplified way of looking at things, that he's particularly interested in Enoch, this figure of Enoch. And there's some extra biblical books that were very influential in the Second Temple Judaism, but they were not included later when it was decided what the canon of the Bible was. And here's the other point, you know, talking about which came first, rabbinic modern Judaism or Christianity. Our current, the Old Testament that Luther insisted that we Christians use is the one that rabbinic Jews decided on in the 9th century AD, after 900 years of conflict with Christians about how to interpret the Old Testament and whether to find Christ in the Old Testament. The rabbis decided, here's the final canon of the Hebrew Bible. Luther insisted that we Christians, Protestants, use the rabbinic Jews' definition of the Old Testament from the 9th century AD, rather than the definition of the Old Testament that the Christians had always accepted from the 1st century with the apostles, and that the apostles themselves quote in the New Testament. So this is one of those kind of discontinuities that he's talking about that don't make any sense at all. So, you know, but that's kind of standard thinking in the Protestant West, particularly here in America. That, so those books, the so-called apocrypha are those books that the church included in the Old Testament, but that the rabbis in the 9th century did not include in the Old Testament. And if we look at what are these specific books, it turns out the ones that come to mind first are the Maccabees. Now, what is it in the Maccabees? It just so happens that the church finds a lot of foundation for the church's beliefs in Maccabees that the rabbis in the 9th century are only too happy to write off, right? Because they're no longer convenient, because, you know, some writings that were pointing toward Christ or that support Christian understandings of Judaism, the true religion of Israel, you know, the rabbis, they were a point of conflict between the rabbis and the Christians. And so the rabbis wrote them off, said, no, we don't believe in these books. And then Protestants have gone along with it, abandoning kind of the early Christian understanding of what these books were. So he's saying these kind of these kind of old dichotomies between, there's the Old Testament and then there's the Apocrypha, and the Apocrypha is just total junk. I mean, it's heretical. You can't even look at it. But the Old Testament is literally word for word from God. He said, what he's saying here is that is a kind of nonsense way of looking at this historically. And then on the next page, Roman numeral 17, at the first full paragraph, the third point. So he's identifying 3 points that he wants this book to address. Finally, he says this book serves an apologetic purpose. And really, this seems to me like really he's restating point 1, because he says that the church does not teach that its faith somehow developed or evolved from that of the apostles or their teaching, nor that its teaching began with the apostles and continued from there. So he's saying instead, the church proclaims that its liturgical ritual and way of life are in complete continuity with that of the apostles. And then, so again, he says a couple lines later, rather, the councils, the ecumenical councils, explained, confirmed, and proclaimed that faith which had already existed for centuries preceding them. So you could say, so this is where the word develop is kind of problematic, because he emphatically states here, no, did not develop or evolve. Okay, he doesn't like the word develop. I mean, other Orthodox theologians will say, yes, it developed. So maybe the better way to understand develop is that it was refined, it was
Codified.
explained, something like that. He in particular does not like this word develop, but it's because he's fighting a particular battle against mainly Protestant critics, right? And so that's why he's kind of taking his stand on this word, where, in my opinion, he should kind of take it easy a little bit. I mean, so we have to define the term. So then, all right, that ends that section. Anybody have any thoughts or questions? I mean, the next part too, you want to discuss it a little bit. St. Paul, a convert. Maybe I won't go through it so analytically. Maybe we can just open it up. I mean, so I think everyone said that they read this bit here, the introduction, St. Paul convert ? So the question to you is, did St. Paul have a conversion experience on the road to Damascus? What does he say in this book?
They knocked down 29 threes to set an NBA record in that game. So 15 to go for Milwaukee.
Who's that? Is that Nejah?
No.
No. Who's got the baseball game going? Jackie, is that you?
65% free throw shooter.
Me?
At least Milwaukee's doing
In
good.
baseball,
I don't think it's me.
you're not having a stroke. I'm hearing it too.
Yeah, I'm hearing it as well. I think it's a basketball game.
Oh, basketball. Where it's 29 degrees.
Oh, free throw shooter. Huh. All right, so did St. Paul have a conversion experience on the road to Damascus?
So they made some tweaks certainly during the offseason.
I think the author would say that he really didn't. It was just kind of a fleshing out, if you will, of the Second Temple beliefs that based off of what Second Temple Judaism believed, that Christ fulfilled that. And so St. Paul was just having another apostolic experience, just like Isaiah or Elijah or any of the other Old Testament prophets. It kind of paints him in the light of an Old Testament prophet, but his revelation came from Christ himself.
Now and would St. Paul have understood himself as converting to something?
I would say not. He had a similar type religious experience as far as being called to do something as Isaiah did or Jeremiah did or Ezekiel did.
Yeah, so on the bottom of page 3, for example, he points to Isaiah 6:8. Isaiah chapter 6 is where Isaiah receives this vision in the temple. Holy, holy, holy art thou, O God, which is where we get a lot of our language that we use in the liturgy about this revelation of this vision of the worship of God. And he notes there that in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is what the early church used, the Greek in Isaiah 6:8 is apostello. God was looking for someone to send to his people to pronounce judgment against them. And so he calls Isaiah to send him, apostello, which is where we get apostle from, the exact word. And then also Jeremiah, he points to Jeremiah that he knew him from his mother's womb, had appointed him to be a prophet unto the nations. This is the exact kind of wording that Paul uses to describe himself in Galatians. So Paul is using the exact language of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is what we know he was familiar with. He's using that same terminology to describe himself and the vision that he received. So for him, there's no question that he's viewing himself in the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament of the people of Israel. That this is not a conversion experience to some new religion by any means. So, like he says at the top of page 4, clearly St. Paul does not see himself as someone who has left Judaism. But yet, did anyone pick up on this? So again, like if we go back to the first page where he paints this picture of what most Christians would think about the early church. If you ask most Christians in America who have been influenced by Protestantism, what is Paul's attitude toward the law? What would most people say? What did St. Paul think about the Old Testament law?
Well, a lot of the people that he was preaching Christianity to thought that he was against the law, that he wanted to destroy it. But that's not the case. As he said himself to the people who wanted to kill him in the temple in Jerusalem, the last time he was there.
And in the Bible study, which we're going to have tomorrow morning, we're right in the thick of this part in Acts. This whole question of even in Paul's time, and the New Testament doesn't shy away from showing us this. There was a perception Paul was against the law, and I would say most Protestants, since Martin Luther, share this perception. They say, yeah, that was a correct perception of Paul, that he was against the law. The law couldn't do anything for us. The interesting thing is that there's a whole bunch of hints, a lot of evidence, not just hints, evidence that Paul didn't think that way at all. What do you guys think?
Somebody needs to be muted. The noise in the background. We can't hear you.
I'll try to mute on, see if. All right. So it's definitely not me because it went away now. All right. So please unmute yourself if you have something to say here. But I think, so St. Paul, for example, Romans 3:31, he cites in the middle of page 4, St. Paul himself refutes such a dichotomy between the law and the gospel, or law and grace, declaring that he seeks not to nullify the law, but to establish it. And we see this also in Acts. He sees there's a continuity with the law. It's not, there was this religion of law, break. Now there's this religion of grace, gospel, and Jesus, new religion. No, there's not this radical break. It's a continuity. But this is not how most Christians would see it. Modern Protestants would see it. They would see this big, the law works, works versus faith versus works. There's the law works, that's gone. That's it's a law-free gospel now. There's nothing you can do. There's no works. I mean, just even to suggest or even think about works or doing things that are in any way reminiscent of the law is basically heresy. I mean, that's just blasphemy. You've not understood Christianity at all, according to the Protestant thinking.
Didn't Jesus say the same things as he walked with the disciples to Emmaus, or whoever went to Emmaus? Didn't he say that something like that?
Like what?
Like that he had come to fulfill the law, not to destroy the law.
Yeah, well, he not on the road to Damascus, he opens the scriptures to them and shows them himself in the Old Testament. And Father Stephen's going to get to that. But elsewhere, like in Matthew, for example, I think you're thinking of the quote from Matthew, where he says, not a jot or a tittle, not even the smallest mark in the law is to be done away with, but is to be fulfilled in him. So it's not this rejection, but this kind of, I would say development, but development in the sense that we've discussed it, not an evolutionary development. Yeah, Neil.
So back to your original question, I know Father Damick's background is, I'm sorry, not Damick, DeYoung. I think he was an evangelical. I can't remember exactly from listening. Yeah.
Well, no, Father Stephen DeYoung, he was a Presbyterian minister, but with a Bible specialist. And Father Andrew, his kind of partner in the podcast, was an evangelical.
Okay, that's what I'm thinking. Well, yeah, so definitely among some Protestant circles, the law gospel dichotomy is a really stringent thing. But I don't think, it's almost like he's taken it to an extreme, and maybe he's just doing this for the sake of argument. But I think a reformed response would be, not that the law has been discarded, because that would be antinomianism, right?
Yeah.
You take it too far. It's not like you just been given a free pass to completely ignore the law and grace covers everything. But I think the perspective would be more, well, Christ has fulfilled the law, but we want to do the same thing because we love Christ so much. We want to do what he does. That's probably what the response would be, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like we've talked about in our Bible study on Acts, like if really one of the kind of linchpins of Acts is Acts chapter 15. And, this is when they have the council in Jerusalem to decide this question of, okay, we have all these Gentiles who want to become Christ followers. What do we do with them? And so it's understandable at that very early stage that there's some confusion because they didn't expect it. But at Jerusalem with Paul there also, it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit that the following was decided. And what was decided for the Gentiles? That they would follow the 4 commandments from the law that were addressed to those who sojourned or resided in Israel, aliens, non-Israelites who resided among the Israelites in the Holy Land, right? And those 4 places where in the Holiness Code in Leviticus, the 4 places where God tells Moses, you shall go to the people and say, and he gives them a law. You shall go to the people and say, he gives them a law. There are 4 times where he says, you shall go to the people and those aliens residing among you, and you shall tell them this. And it's those 4 places that the Jerusalem Council draws out and says, these are the 4 things that the Gentiles who want to be Christ followers shall keep. And it includes not worshiping idols, refraining from sexual immorality, and kind of 2 variations on not eating blood in animals and not eating animals that are strangled. So it's those 4 things, though, that the Gentiles are supposed to keep, according to the first council of the church in Jerusalem, are themselves the law. They've simply made a determination of who the Gentiles are according to the law. They identify them as, okay, when the law speaks about those aliens, non-Israelites who reside among us, that's how we will consider the Gentiles. They are people, non-Israelites, who are seeking to join the people of Israel and reside among us, the true people of Israel, the Christ believers, and they will follow the law as it applies to those who are not Israelites, right? So they're following the law. I mean, so it seems like it's usually presented as, okay, the Gentiles get a pass. They don't have to follow the law. And I guess you could see it that way, but it's rather that they do have to follow the law, but in their proper capacity as people who are sojourning or residing among the people of Israel and not full Israelites because they weren't being circumcised, etc. Does that make sense? So instead of seeing it as, yes, they are following the law, it's usually perceived as, no, they're not following the law, but they actually are. All right, and so the last section here, we'll wrap up in 2 minutes. The last section, I think, this is where I would say this is Father Stephen's biggest contribution, where there's not a lot of talk about this, is he has a particular interest in the mystical tradition, and particularly the Enochic tradition. So this tradition that developed around this figure of Enoch in the Old Testament, who was this kind of mysterious figure, a lot of extra biblical literature about it that wasn't included in the Old Testament. But there's this deep mystical tradition of Second Temple Judaism that he brings up and he points to, and especially the Shema, which is still said is central to even modern Judaism. The Shema from Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one." This was something that they would say, and they do say daily. So he's suggesting that there was this mystical tradition that St. Paul would have been a part of or been aware of, and that St. Paul was even meditating on this and repeating this phrase on the road to Damascus. And so it's through this kind of mystical prayer that he has this vision from Jesus, not only Jesus as a prophet, but Jesus as God, calling him to be a prophet of his people Israel, not a new religion, not a new people, the old people, Israel. And then Father Stephen wants to connect this to the Hesychist tradition that we have, the Jesus prayer, "Oh Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner." And so he's saying, so even this part of the tradition, our Orthodox tradition, the Jesus prayer, he's saying this is not an evolution. This is not a development. This is rooted in the Second Temple Jewish tradition that St. Paul himself would have been a part of. Everyone follow that? To me, that's the one of the most kind of intriguing claims that Father Stephen makes. And I think he's really on this.
I like, Father, the use of the word Merkaba mysticism, which is the chariot mysticism.
Yeah.
Merkaba is the same word in my language. Merkaba is a person who's riding is a rakib, which is the same source of the word, is a passenger. And so the fact that like Elijah and then Enoch and these people who have been taken up, I think this is what he's saying, that St. Paul is going back to that mystical side that people do not talk about much, but that evolved eventually into the Kabbalah mysticism, which is we still have some of it today. We don't hear much about it, or let's say we don't delve into it. But that's what you're saying, this mystical experience that, as they repeated the Shema, and St. Paul was in deep maybe meditation on the Shema, and that today the Jesus that leads to that Hesychistic, if I'm pronouncing that
you're breaking
correctly.
You're breaking up again really bad. I don't know if it's just for me or.
I'm sorry.
No, it's for me too. I can barely make a sentence.
My guess is the phone. I would try next time, if you can't come in through something other than the phone. It might be give a little bit better. I'm sorry.
So sorry that it's not coming through clearly.
You're back now. You're good
Yeah,
now.
now it's fine.
Well, it might be because it's in my hand. Maybe that's part of the. But I was just saying that I thought when I read about the Merkaba, the chariot mysticism,
No,
I was very fascinated with that because of and that came from the Old Testament, and that possibly Saint Paul was actually in that mystical, his mystical experience on the road to Damascus was not a conversion, but rather an experience in the tradition of the Old Testament, Elijah and Ezekiel and so on. So anyway, I just thought it was very interesting that he referred to the fact that today the prayer of the Jesus prayer and the monasteries are kind of a follow-up to that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And that there is that mysticism that we rarely talk about in our own personal circles here. It's almost like it's strictly in the monastic system rather than it is in our daily life.
Yeah. Okay, Neil, you had your hand up?
Yeah, just real quickly. So one of the things I sort of was perplexed by is it seems like one of his primary premises that he's trying to establish is that Orthodoxy is just a continuation of Second Temple Judaism. So I was thinking, well, okay, that's interesting, but what's special about Second Temple Judaism? I mean, why couldn't there be an abrupt break or whatnot? And so maybe what you just said is the key to that. Maybe is it because he wants to connect with mysticism, which he connects with Second Temple Judaism? I mean, does the Book of Enoch come from Second Temple Judaism?
That's when the tradition develops. Yeah, because you look at ancient Judaism. Ancient Judaism is really not interested in any kind of speculation, kind of otherworldly speculation. I mean, ancient Judaism is very tangible, practical, you could say, in a sense. You commit this sin, you atone for it by sacrificing this animal. This is exactly how the altar is supposed to look like. This is exactly how the sacrifice is supposed to be. I mean, it's really later development that you have this kind of burgeoning of interest in these figures that are from the Old Testament of Ezekiel and Enoch, but that there's this mystery surrounding them. That the Old Testament, with Enoch, the Old Testament says very little about Enoch, but it becomes this point of kind of speculation over time. So the mystical tradition, I would say, develops or is fleshed out in Second Temple Judaism, and that it really was kind of a hot topic around Jesus's time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so, yeah.
And he refers
I don't think there's any reason that he doesn't. I don't think there's any reason like, well, you say what's so special about Second Temple Judaism. I think that's right. It could be a radical break. I think on this point, we've talked about he's trying to show what his objectives are in the book. I mean, I think on this point, he's actually just trying to be faithful to history, and to push back against this kind of oversimplification that has emerged since Martin Luther, that he thinks really has to do more with Martin Luther's own kind of personal experiences with a kind of corrupt Western Catholic Church in the 16th century, and really is not being faithful to history. So I don't know that so much that he wants to like push an agenda other than to let's have a fair reading of history. Let's find out what the truth is.
Okay.
Father Gregory, what would be your view as far as Martin Luther? Why did he side, with 9th century rabbinic, Judaism as far as the canon is concerned? Would it be because of the Catholic faith, or the Catholic Church would have said this is the canon, so he just went with another list with rabbinic, Judaism? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it was a beef with the authority of the Catholic Church, and that he's trying to find another foothold, another source of authority besides the Catholic Church. And so Martin, the Greeks are the most Christian people and the best followers of the gospel on earth. Martin Luther. Yeah. So yeah, I think he's got a big problem with the Catholic Church. And in his defense, I'll say he's got good reason. I mean, the Catholic Church in the 16th century in his time was corrupt. I mean, there was a lot to protest. But, I think basically, his construction of the sola scriptura, only the scriptures, is really a project to craft another authority source that doesn't involve the Catholic
Church, right?
So then really, the caricature that people say that, so instead of one pope, now every Protestant is his own pope, and you have millions of popes determining how they're going to read the Bible. I mean, I think that's true. It was all about changing the authority. Jason?
It seems like just a general way that, I guess, since like the Catholics are separated from the Orthodox, that there was this preoccupation with just salvation, I guess because they lost this idea of like the way to live, like it's a holistic type of religion. It's not just to get you into heaven. And so that explains like the Protestant backlash is all, and why this focuses on like the law and the gospel. Like all we're trying to figure out is how to get to heaven. We're not even worried about how you live right now. Like we're just trying to answer that one question. It seems like when we try to argue about the role of the law, then with Orthodox, we're thinking of it as a holistic type of place, whereas they're coming at it from a, how do I get to heaven type. That's it.
Yeah.
And
I think he was trying to remove what he was seeing in the Catholic Church was this kind of playing on the church, playing on people's maybe insecurity about their salvation, as this kind of source of power for this corrupt magisterium, and trying to take away that source of power from them and saying, nothing depends on you guys and your granting indulgences and this and merits and all this nonsense. It's Jesus did it. It's done. You have nothing. There's nothing we need from you anymore. We don't need your blessing anymore. It's done. So he kind of oversimplified it. And you see where he's coming from, but it introduces a kind of black and white, or it reshapes the whole question in a way that's problematic. And so I think what he's trying to do in this book is just try to get us past that and go back and let's have a real examination of what was actually going on in history. All right, let's wrap up. So I think since you guys are such an overachieving group, I think we should try to just assign all of chapter 1, which would be pages 13 through 52. So not part 1, but chapter 1 of part 1, 13 to 52. And if if it proves kind of difficult or something, then we'll just spend extra time on it next time. Does it sound? And next Monday is Memorial Day, so I'm fine to meet, but it's up to you guys. Who's not going to be available next Monday evening, Memorial Day? No, Cynthia. Denise, maybe.
I don't think I will be. Not sure.
No, Jackie.
I'm good for Memorial Day.
Is that John? Who are you talking? Is that Angela?
Hey.
Yeah. I'll be coming back from seeing my friend in Portland, but we have a layover in Denver. It's perfect timing. We'll be able.
Angela looks so studious with her glasses on there. All right, Neil Finley, are you available?
Hey, I wanted to do one more thing, by the way, really, really fast that we didn't get to talk about. The part about that he was talking about translations.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting. Just from from my perspective as a poet, it's sort of a Herculean task to do any translation of anyone else's words. And that statement, all translations of the scriptures and other ancient sources are my own. I thought that was really did that seem really bold to you, or was that just me? I mean, I felt like he was just making this pronouncement, like, okay, I'm laying it out here. I might not know everything, or it might not be right, but I'm, this is what I'm doing.
I see I see now that it could sound that way, but in academics, that's the norm. That
it was just a pronounce, these are my else's.
Because it's assumed, you know, if you're a Bible scholar, it's assumed that you know very well the source languages, and he's
Right.
actually even above and beyond the norm. I mean, he knows the
Obvious. Yeah.
Ugaritic. I mean, he taught himself or learned Ugaritic, which is this dead
No,
language of peoples surrounding Israel. You
The
know,
language of
I mean,
ogres.
so he knows you know, he's more than qualified to produce his own
Right.
translations.
Yeah. I just thought it was interesting. And then he said it was more of an art than a science. I thought was also really interesting. So that there's a little subjectivity in that, even with something as, you know, weighted as this. I just thought that was,
Yeah. I mean, you really have to. I even do that sometimes. You know, if I'm looking at a sermon, you know, I might use. You know, usually there are some translations that are pretty close. I mean, you know, I might tweak it slightly, but sometimes you just have to use your own translation,
Right. Right.
for it to make sense in context.
yeah.
All right. Well, so let's say, because it's a long chapter, let's meet in 2 weeks. How about that? Because I think, and then some of the people who weren't here tonight are also not going to be available next week, and then they will really be behind the 8 ball. So let's meet in 2 weeks, which is like June 7th, I think. Monday, June 7th. And then I think we'll be off to the races. All right. So you got 2 weeks to read chapter 1. If you have any questions, you know, highlight them, make notes in your book, and we'll discuss. All right, thanks, guys. That's very
Thank you.
interesting.
Thank you, Father.
Bless you guys. Bye bye.
you.
Good night.
Good night.